The first thing Caroline Whitfield felt was the cold concrete against her knees, and the second was the sound of laughter behind her, sharp and bright as breaking glass. She had been 7 months pregnant when Grant shoved her, not hard enough to be undeniable in a courtroom, not hard enough to leave a mark anyone could photograph and frame as evidence, just hard enough, a flat palm between her shoulder blades, to send her stumbling off the curb outside the Hawthorne Club, and down onto one knee in the wet gravel of the parking apron, her hands flying out instinctively to catch herself before her belly hit the ground. The valet line scattered. Someone gasped. Nobody moved to help her up. "For God's sake, Caroline," Grant said, not even looking back at her, brushing rain off the shoulder of his overcoat like it was the inconvenience that mattered. "You're being dramatic." Behind him, Whitney Sorrell stood under the portico in a cream-colored dress that had clearly never been rained on, filming the whole thing on her phone with the soft, satisfied smile of a woman who had been waiting 4 years for this exact moment to arrive. Beside Whitney, dry beneath the awning, Diane Pearson, Grant's mother, a woman who had spent the entirety of Caroline's marriage perfecting the art of saying cruel things in a kind voice, watched her daughter-in-law kneel in the gravel with an expression of pure, undisguised satisfaction. "She's always been a bit much," Diane said to no one in particular. "I told you, Grant, some women aren't built for this life." Caroline knelt there for 11 seconds. She counted them, the way she counted everything when the world tried to take her balance. 1, 2, 3. Because counting was a thing she had learned a long time ago. In a different life, under circumstances none of these people would ever understand. She pressed one hand flat against the curve of her stomach and felt her daughter shift inside her. A small protest against the jolt, and she breathed. Then she reached up with her free hand and closed her fingers around the pendant at her throat. It was small, easy to miss, a flat silver key, no longer than her thumb, worn smooth at the edges from 11 years of being touched exactly like this. In moments when she needed to remember who she actually was, underneath the cardigans and the minivan and the casserole dishes, and the name Caroline Pearson, which she had worn for 4 years, like a coat that was never quite the right size. She did not cry. She did not say anything to Grant, or to Whitney, or to Diane, who were already turning back toward the warm gold light spilling out of the club's entrance, already forgetting she existed. She got to her feet, brushed the gravel from her coat, and walked, not ran, walked, with the kind of steadiness that had been trained into her since she was a girl, to the edge of the parking circle, out of the light, and made one phone call. "It's time," she said, when the line picked up. "Bring the car around, both of them." 12 minutes later, 2 black SUVs rolled into the Hawthorne Club's circular drive with a silence that didn't belong to vehicles that size. A man in a charcoal suit stepped out of the lead car holding an umbrella and a folded wool blanket. And without a word, he draped it over Caroline's shoulders and guided her, one hand hovering protectively near her elbow, toward the open rear door. Grant didn't see any of it. He was inside by then, his arm around Whitney's waist, accepting a flute of champagne from a passing tray, already telling someone near the bar a story that would, within the week, no longer be funny to anyone who heard it. To understand what happened in that parking lot, you had to understand who Caroline Whitfield actually was. Not who she had let Grant Pearson believe she was for 4 years, but the person underneath, the one she had spent over a decade learning to disappear inside of. She had been born Caroline Ashworth, the only child of Julian Ashworth, a man whose name appeared on almost nothing public and yet sat, quietly and almost invisibly, at the center of more wealth than most countries' annual budgets: shipping, private equity, a controlling stake in half the commercial real estate corridor that ran through 3 major cities, including, though he had never once mentioned this to his daughter's husband, the very development firm Grant worked for. Julian had raised Caroline alone after her mother died when she was 11, and he had raised her with a single unbending philosophy. A name like Ashworth did not protect you from people. It made you a target for them. He had watched too many of his colleagues' children grow up surrounded by bodyguards and prenuptial agreements, and a permanent, corrosive uncertainty about who actually loved them and who loved the number attached to their name. He refused to let that happen to his daughter. So when Caroline turned 18, Julian did something almost no one in his world ever did. He let her go. Not estranged her. They spoke every week, met quietly twice a year in places no one photographed. But he let her build a life under her mother's maiden name, Whitfield, with a modest trust that paid for school and nothing flashy beyond it. And he told her, Find out who loves you when there's nothing to gain. Then if you ever need it, you'll know the door is still there. She became an occupational therapist. She worked with children who had motor delays and sensory processing disorders. Kids who needed someone with the patience to count to 100 in a quiet voice while they learned to hold a spoon. She was good at it. The same stillness that had been trained into her as a girl, the same capacity to absorb impact without breaking, made her extraordinary with frightened, frustrated children. She drove a 6-year-old sedan. She lived, before Grant, in a 1-bedroom apartment with water stains on the ceiling and a window unit that rattled all summer. She met Grant Pearson at a friend's wedding. He was handsome in the particular way of men who have never had to work very hard for anything. Good bones, good teeth, a laugh that filled a room. And in the beginning he was attentive in a way that felt, to a woman who had spent her whole life being told, that people only wanted access, almost unbearably sincere. He didn't know who her father was. She never told him. She told herself, in the early months, that this was the test working exactly as her father had designed it. A man who loved Caroline Whitfield, the occupational therapist with the rattling window unit, not Caroline Ashworth, the heir. The trouble was that Grant turned out to be the kind of man who needed, eventually, to be the most important person in every room he entered. And a wife who quietly, competently managed every part of his life without complaint had a way of becoming furniture to a man like that. By their 2nd year of marriage, Caroline had become the quiet one to Diane Pearson's friends, the woman who cooked, who managed the household accounts, who never raised her voice, who folded herself smaller and smaller to make room for a husband who took up more space every year. Grant had stopped asking about her day sometime around year 3. By year 4, he'd started disappearing on Thursday evenings, and Caroline, who had spent her whole life learning to read rooms for danger, knew exactly what that meant long before she found the hotel receipt in his jacket. She had not confronted him immediately. She had done what her father raised her to do. She gathered information quietly, completely, without revealing her hand. She learned that the woman was Whitney Sorrell, a junior associate at Grant's firm, 12 years younger than Caroline. She learned the affair had been going on for 8 months. She learned, with a cold clarity that surprised even her, that Diane had known for at least 6 of those months and had said nothing. Because Diane had never liked Caroline, had never understood what her son saw in a nobody from nowhere, who didn't even have family to speak of at the wedding. What none of them knew, what Caroline had let them believe, the way her father had taught her to let the world believe what was convenient, was that she had spent those same 8 months quietly meeting with her father's attorneys, restructuring her trust, and preparing for the moment she would no longer need to pretend. She was already pregnant by then. She told herself the baby deserved a real chance at a family before she pulled the foundation out from under the life she'd built. She told herself a lot of things in those last months. The way people do when they're not ready yet to admit things is already over. The push outside the Hawthorne Club simply confirmed what she had already decided. It just happened sooner and more publicly than she'd planned. The 2 months that followed moved with a precision that, looking back, Caroline would recognize as the same precision she'd applied her whole life to crisis. The steady counting, the controlled breath, the refusal to let panic dictate the next move. She did not go back to the house she'd shared with Grant. The SUVs took her instead to a brownstone in the city's Old North Quarter that she hadn't set foot in for over a decade, a property that had belonged to her mother, held in a trust under a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know to look for it. Julian Ashworth met her there himself, stepping out of the kitchen in shirt sleeves with 2 cups of tea, looking at his daughter's wet hair and her hand pressed protectively over her stomach, with an expression that contained no surprise at all, only a grief that had clearly been waiting a long time for permission to surface. "I knew," he said simply. "6 months ago. I had someone keeping an eye, the way I always do. I didn't say anything, because you needed to be the one to decide when you were ready." Caroline had expected to feel angry at that, at the surveillance, the secrecy, the years of silence. But instead she felt something closer to relief, the particular relief of finally setting down a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying alone the whole time. Grant did not handle her disappearance well. For the first week, he assumed she'd gone to her sister's. Except Caroline didn't have a sister, a fact that had never once given him pause in 4 years of marriage. By the 2nd week, when his calls went straight to a disconnected number, and his lawyer's letters came back unanswered, panic set in, the particular panic of a man, who had never once imagined his wife capable of leaving without his permission. By the third week, two things happened nearly simultaneously that changed the shape of his life permanently. The first was that Whitney Sorrell, having gotten what she wanted, Grant's full attention, his apartment, his last name dangled as a promise, discovered exactly how much of Grant's lifestyle had actually been funded, quietly and invisibly, by his wife's family money. Money that had just been pulled, in its entirety, the moment Caroline's attorneys filed the paperwork. The cars, the club membership, the renovated kitchen Diane had bragged about to her friends, all of it traced back, eventually, to a trust Caroline had been managing without ever once mentioning its existence. Whitney left within the month, taking with her the distinct impression that she had bet everything on a man, with considerably less than she'd assumed. The second thing was that Grant's employer, Halbrook Pierce Development, the firm where Grant had spent 11 years climbing toward a partnership he believed was inevitable, was, as it turned out, 40% owned by a holding company that, 3 weeks after the incident outside the Hawthorne Club, suddenly and very quietly changed its voting instructions. Grant was not fired outright. Nothing so clumsy. He was simply, gradually, removed from every meeting that mattered, passed over for the partnership he'd been promised, shuffled into a role with a smaller office and a much smaller future, by executives who had received no explanation for the change, and had not thought to ask for one, because that was not how that kind of money operated. It simply moved, and things rearranged themselves around where it went. Caroline never gave a single interview, never wrote a single public word about any of it. She didn't need to. She had simply, completely, removed herself from a system that turned out to be far more dependent on her, her money, her quiet competence, her invisible scaffolding, than anyone inside it had ever bothered to notice while she was still standing there, holding it up. Her daughter was born on a Tuesday in early spring, 6 weeks after the night in the rain. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and a furious cry that made the delivery room nurses laugh. Caroline named her Margot, after no one, a name with no weight attached to it, no family expectation folded inside it, just a name that was entirely, freshly hers. Julian was in the waiting room the whole night, and when they finally let him in to meet his granddaughter, he held her like something that might shatter. And Caroline watched her father's face do something she had not seen it do since her mother died. A kind of open, undefended tenderness he had spent 30 years keeping carefully under wraps. "She has your stubborn chin," he told Caroline. "She has yours," Caroline said. I checked. Grant requested visitation through his attorney 4 months later. Caroline allowed it. Not because she felt she owed him anything, but because she had decided, in the quiet weeks after Margot's birth, that her own bitterness was not a debt she intended to pass on to her daughter. She let Margot know her father. She simply made sure, with the same precision she applied to everything, that Margot would never need him for anything that actually mattered. Not money, not safety, not the architecture of a stable life. "Tell him I've already forgiven him," she told her attorney, the week the custody arrangement was finalized. "And tell him forgiveness and reconciliation were never going to be the same thing." There was a man named Theo Calloway who Caroline had known peripherally for most of her life. The son of one of her father's oldest friends, a structural engineer who had spent a decade building bridges in places most people never thought about. A man who had known exactly who the Ashworths were since he was a teenager and had never once, in all the years their families crossed paths, at holiday gatherings and charity dinners, treated Caroline like anything other than a person worth talking to. He reappeared in her life 9 months after the rain, at one of her father's quieter dinners, and he was, infuriatingly and wonderfully, exactly as steady as she remembered. He didn't propose anything. He didn't rush. For the better part of a year he simply showed up. Fixed the loose hinge on the brownstone's back gate without being asked. Sat on the kitchen floor for 45 minutes, helping Margot stack blocks with the same patient attention Caroline used to bring to her own patients. Never once made Caroline feel like she needed to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating to hold his interest. He had, she came to realize, always been capable of feeding himself. A small, stupid thing to notice, except that after 4 years with Grant, it didn't feel small at all. On a Sunday morning in early autumn, 11 months after the night outside the Hawthorne Club, Caroline sat on the rooftop terrace of her mother's old brownstone with a cup of coffee going cold beside her, and Margot on her lap, reaching up with small, determined fingers toward the silver key pendant at her throat. Theo sat across from her in a wicker chair he'd dragged up from the garden, a plate of toast balanced on his knee, watching his daughter. Because by then, quietly, undramatically, in the way things sometimes simply become true, she'd become that too. Examine the world with the grave. Total focus of someone encountering light for the first time. Caroline's old dog, a scruffy, gray-muzzled terrier mix named Baxter, who had been the one thing she'd insisted on bringing with her, the very same night the SUVs came, slept against her feet, twitching occasionally at some dream. Margot's fingers closed around the key. Caroline felt the chain tug gently against the back of her neck and let herself think, for the first time without flinching, about everything the small silver shape had carried her through. Her mother's hospital room when she was 11. The years of being told her name was a danger. She had to learn to hide the gravel digging into her knees outside a club that no longer mattered to her at all, the single phone call that had unmade and remade her entire life inside of 12 minutes. She was not angry anymore. The anger had done its work and been allowed, finally, to rest. She was not sad in any way that lingered. Grief still came in waves sometimes, unpredictable. But she had stopped fighting it, let it move through her and pass on. She had not wanted revenge, not really, not the kind people imagined when they heard the story secondhand. What she had wanted was simply to stop disappearing. The rest, Grant's stalled career, Whitney's quiet exit, Diane's friends slowly realizing exactly how the money had always worked, had not been punishment Caroline orchestrated. It had simply been the truth, finally visible, once she stopped holding the whole structure up with her own two hands. Margot's fingers opened. She reached for the morning light instead, the way babies do, indiscriminately reaching for whatever was brightest. Caroline lifted her daughter a little higher into the sun and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the full and total weight of everything she had carried settle, finally, into a shape she could actually hold. She had spent years hiding her name to find out who would love her without it. What she found instead, in a parking lot in the rain, was the precise edge of how little some people had ever actually seen her at all. And in the space that opened up after that, quiet, unglamorous, entirely her own, she found something she hadn't expected to be looking for. She found the rest of her life waiting, patient as a key in a closed hand, for her to finally stop hiding it.